All right, so welcome to the podcast that we're doing to go along with the Athenaeum Book Club, and I'm really excited to get a chance to do these interviews. And if you don't know who I am, the guys at Athenaeum were nice enough to ask me to do this. I've been somebody that's been covering the Roman Empire for a number of years in a lot of my threads on X. So I'm at Jeremy Ryan Slate over there. I run a company called Command Your Brand that we are a PR agency that places our clients on high-level podcasts. And then for those of you that are new to Athenaeum and have not checked it out, make sure you check out athenaeumbooks.com as well to check out everything over there. And I'm excited about our first guest today because when I was discussing this with the team at Athenaeum, I wanted to really do something in the classics world to start because it was something that really is near and dear to my heart. We are going to talk about a lot of different topics, not in the show, but in the interviews we do. Like in the future, I want to cover Dostoevsky with Crime and Punishment. I want to cover Tolstoy. There's a lot of different great books we can cover. And today's guest is an expert on the lives that were put together by Plutarch. And the interesting thing about it is there's so many different directions we could have gone with this, right? Because Plutarch has individual lives he covers. He has parallel lives of Romans and Greeks. So in today's conversation, we wanted to focus on the life of Pericles. So without further ado, I want to introduce my wonderful guest today, who I've had the luck of doing conversations with on a number of different times. Alex Petkas, thanks for hanging out with me today, sir.
Great to be here, Jeremy.
So for people that don't know who you are, Alex, we are going to talk about Pericles today, but tell us a bit about who you are and what you do, man.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Jeremy. I am a former academic. I quit my tenure track job in 2020, and I was a classicist. I am a classicist, I guess. So I really was a specialist of ancient Greek philosophy in the later Roman Empire. And I decided a few years ago to start the Cost of Glory podcast because it was a reflection of how I thought people should approach the classics, what the best way in, especially for people who are out there living their lives in the world, trying to get the best stuff from antiquity. And it's kind of overwhelming. There's so many great books to read. What should you read first? Why should you be reading? What should you be doing while you're reading? And all of these questions I felt like I had a better answer to after studying not just the classics, but the way that the ancient readers and the ancient teachers would approach these texts. And so the Cost of Glory podcast is kind of my answer, my proposal for how best to go about it. And it's basically through biography. I do these long form dramatic biographies of Plutarch's heroes. Really, it's all kind of based on Plutarch. And I've done about a quarter of them so far, Greeks and Romans, and we can get a little bit more into Plutarch as we go. But that's kind of my full-time gig now.
So the thing I wanted to start first and foremost before we talk about Pericles is I want to talk a little bit about who Plutarch is and I guess what his world and his worldview would have looked like. So I guess let's start there. At what time is he writing? What things would he have been dealing with, and what would his worldview have looked like?
Yeah, so this kind of relates to my interest in the ancient philosophers. So Plutarch is basically, he's known to history best as the author of the Parallel Lives, but this biography collection of 48 Greeks and Romans. But he is a philosopher, statesman. Statesman is a bit of an exaggeration, maybe. He was a local politician in Greece in the late 1st century AD. So his years of activity are maybe 60 AD to 110 AD. And that is the time of the Pax Romana. So it's the Romans rule everything from most of Britain to, the Straits of Gibraltar all the way to Palestine and Egypt and including Greece. So he's a subject of the Roman Empire. I believe he's a Roman citizen. And later in life, he becomes the priest or one of the priests at the Temple of Delphi. So he's a kind of local man of action in his way. And I mean, he's not a senator, but he's well connected. And he is writing, I think, to educate, instruct, and entertain the upper classes, both of people in Greece and of his Roman friends, let's say friends instead of overlords. And this is a big piece of his conception of why the parallel lives was an interesting idea, because essentially he's taking the heroes of the Greeks and helping the Romans appreciate them, helping and taking the heroes of the Romans and helping the Greeks appreciate them. And so there's not a lot of warfare going on. There's always kind of turmoil at the imperial court, but it's sort of like reflecting back on the virtues of the past in order to face the challenges of the present as an upstanding person endowed with, you know, moderate to intense levels of responsibility in the Roman world.
So I'm curious too, because there's also viewpoints that writers have as well, and if you look at a lot of Gibbon's work, I think people don't realize about Gibbon that he was raised Catholic, and then his father kind of takes responsibility for make him more into the Church of England later in his life, and that's actually a large thing that when you understand that, you look at how the decline and fall of the Roman Empire is written differently. So I'm curious when we look at the work of Plutarch in this way. You had mentioned things happening at the Roman court. I'm curious if politics of the day would have any influence on what and how he's writing and the lessons he's trying to teach.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. He's writing mostly under the good emperors. He does write some works on the year of the four emperors. You know, when Nero was assassinated, there was this quick churn of emperors that ended up with this Vespasian being in power. And mostly he tries to avoid the topic of contemporary politics because, you know, it
He
can
wants
be
to stay
kind of
alive.
dangerous. He wants to stay alive, you know, doesn't want to get on anybody's bad side. Um, but but I think that and I think that influences his work in that he stops his biographies with Mark Antony, who died in 31 BC. So it's at least 100 years between him and all the subjects that he studies in his biographies. Um, and, you know, by his time, there's not really party politics
Sure.
meaningfully in for statesmen. It's like, how close are you to the emperor? How close are you to the Senate? There's a bit of a divide in imperial politics between the kind of old note families and the Senate. But by the time Plutarch is writing, most of that has been kind of ground down into a monarchy. And it's just kind of court factions. But he does want the Greeks to not revolt. You know, he thinks that would be a very bad idea, for example. And he wants the Romans to treat them with the dignity that he thinks they deserve as the kind of cultural engine of Rome in a lot of ways.
So I'm curious as well. You know, as I said in the introduction, there's a lot of different lives that Plutarch does cover. But when I asked you which one you'd like to cover, Pericles was one that you picked out. I'm curious for you, um, what made you want to select that one, or was there something about him, his character, or what was kind of the thing that made you pick him?
Well, I think Pericles is really interesting for an entree into Plutarch because he was one of the two most important Greek statesmen and the two kind of models of ideal statesmanship for Plutarch. I think maybe a boyhood hero of his. And the other one would be Alexander the Great. But Pericles is maybe not a household name. So who is this guy? Well, he is Athens's greatest statesman who was at the helm of the Athenian democracy in its apex in the 5th century BC, which is when shortly after Athens defeated the Persians and together with the Spartans and the whole Greek coalition, the Great Persian Wars, Thermopylae, etc., Battle of Salamis. The generation after that is when Pericles rises to power, and he's also at the helm when Athens gets into its worst war, and that ends in defeat, the Peloponnesian War, which they fought amongst the Greeks. But Pericles is the man responsible mainly for building the Acropolis as we see it today, financing the Parthenon, and just making Athens the glorious thing that we kind of remember it to be. It's the age. He's a contemporary of Sophocles, the playwright, Euripides. He's a contemporary of Herodotus. He's a contemporary of sort of a young Socrates. There's all of these intellectuals floating around Athens. He's really at the height of its kind of cultural influence. So I think he's fascinating for that reason, and like a quite a talented statesman too. We can get into that as well.
So, well, first of all, I'm going to apologize to you and then also to our listeners and readers, but my Greek pronunciations are not the best, so I will be expecting hopefully some correction from you when I totally butcher them. But when we're looking at how Plutarch starts, he starts with Pericles' lineage, with his son Xanthippus, if that's correct,
Hmm.
the victor of Mycale, and his education under philosophers like Anaxagoras.
Yeah.
How does this background shape him into an Olympian leader that Plutarch describes? And what of those early influences highlight his blend of intellect and action?
Well, since we're beginning at the beginning, I think there was a viral tweet that got a lot of attention yesterday, and the actual beginning of the life of Pericles is uh, interesting because Plutarch spends a lot of time in the introductory sections of lives that he thinks are especially important. So like the life of Alexander this has got this long kind of methodological introduction. You got to look at not just the great battles that a man fights, but the jokes that he makes with his friends to really understand his character. Well, in the life of Pericles, he opens with this quote that maybe I can just read it real quick.
Go
It's
for it.
kind of funny. If you know anybody like this, you'll laugh. On seeing certain wealthy foreigners in Rome carrying puppies and young monkeys about their bosoms and fondling them, Caesar, we are told, if the women Caesar asked, we are told, if the women in their country did not bear children, thus in right princely fashion rebuking those who squander on animals that proneness to love and loving affection which is ours by nature and which is due only to our fellow men. So there were people in Caesar's day that were basically millennial dog moms. And this is Augustus Caesar reproaching them for not having children, and he winds up into a point about how our affections are guided by the content, the things that we spend time around. And one of the best things to spend time around, according to Plutarch, is the lives of great men, because they have this kind of magnetic effect that can draw you to virtue. And I mean, this ties into Pericles' upbringing. He's around a lot of really high caliber people. On the political side, he comes from a political family. They're descendants of Solon, the lawgiver, I think through his mother's side. Xanthippus, his dad, is the general at this very important Greek battle, Mycale. And so he comes from this great tradition of it's an aristocratic household. But interestingly, Pericles begins his political career and really leads most of it as more of a moderate populist. So there are these great aristocratic families that dominate Athens, power politics. But Pericles was one of the people that took some measures, was in the party that sort of robbed them of some of their influence. There was this council called the Areopagus, which was kind of Athens's senate. And it was under the watch of a friend of a close political ally of Pericles that the Areopagus was turned from a governing body of the state into essentially a murder court.
Wow.
uh, and which is a huge loss of influence by them. And but this was part of the idea of giving more power to the people, and also tying into his education. The mass democracy has a greater scope for the power of persuasion than an aristocracy, and this was one of Pericles' key skills that he developed as a young man. And he's a product not just of this aristocratic upbringing, but of this new kind of education that is going around in Athens. Famously, if you've read some of Plato's dialogues, you've heard of the sophists, who
Sure.
are these intellectual entrepreneurs. I like to think of them as intellectual entrepreneurs. They sometimes get called grifters, just like any intellectual entrepreneur. I've been called a grifter, so I sympathize with them a little bit. But they're promising the traditional education of the upper classes was called music, and that does involve some lyre playing and dancing, but it involves a lot of memorization of poetry. But the sophists came along and they said, that's good and fine. You can do all of that. But what you should spend most of your time on is learning how to speak in public and persuade mass assemblies, both mass voting assemblies like that would vote on policies. Athens has this assembly that would, decide war or peace and all kinds of taxes, that kind of thing. But they also have these law courts that are filled with typically hundreds of Athenian common men. And the law courts are not just about legal wranglings with your neighbor. They are the kind of high treason courts. They are the final arbiter on whether a law is constitutional or not. So there's all kinds of ways in which you really can lever up in politics by being able to persuade crowds of people, and the sophists can give you that skill. And he had an educator that Plutarch says kind of masqueraded as a music teacher, but was in fact a sophist. Damon is the guy's name. So that was a really important influence on Pericles. He's such a good orator. This comes out in Thucydides' Peloponnesian War, where Pericles is kind of the hero of the first part of the book. But then there is this other kind of intellectual entrepreneur, which we think of as a philosopher, but they would have called themselves probably physiologists, physiologoi, natural philosophers. Anaxagoras is the guy's name. And Anaxagoras is theorizing the nature of the universe, that it's all kind of these disparate elements kind of united under this nous, this divine mind that operates everything, that the universe is intelligible. But he's also kind of a political advisor. There's a lot of these physiologists they had this story that they would tell you about the way that nature worked. They're kind of scientists on some level. Thales says that everything is water, and the earthquakes are just kind of these great masses of land knocking against each other as they float on this giant body of water. And there's various theories about that, but a lot of them are actually very influential and kind of political advisors to kings, politicians, etc. And so Anaxagoras is very much in that model for Pericles. So he's in this kind of intellectual brew. And Thucydides, another very important text on Pericles, the funeral oration that he gives, one of his most famous speeches, he says, Athens is the school of Hellas, the school of Greece. And that's kind of what he's talking about. There's the tragic shows, all the best intellectual talent, the best cultural talent comes to Athens, and Pericles is right there in the mix with them. Like he's just working the crowd, working the room rather, for kind of, Athens's intellectual credibility and influence.
If you ever get a chance, there's a great SNL skit where Jack Black goes to the first. He's in ancient Athens, and he goes to the first play ever created. And the actors are up on stage, and they're describing who they are. And he's like, "You are not a king. You are my neighbor." And I'm gonna have to send it to you. It's very funny to see people responding to the first Athenian play.
Nice.
But when we look at how Plutarch starts with telling this story, he says that Pericles embodies virtues like prudence and eloquence, but also faces accusations of tyranny, which is something we talked about in that period of Athens. What's a central theme in his life? Is it perhaps the tension between the democratic leadership and personal ambition that most reveals Plutarch's moral lens, or what are your thoughts on that?
That is kind of it in a nutshell. And we said Plutarch is writing in the late 1st century AD, and so he's living 500 years or so after Pericles. And one of his sources, not his only source, is Thucydides, which you can also read. It's a more difficult text, but it's very rewarding. Maybe you read the life of Pericles first, Plutarch's life of Pericles, then you go to Thucydides. But Thucydides says that Athens was a democracy in name, but in fact, the rule of the first citizen. And that was, and in his mind, that was a good thing, because democracy is inherently an unstable constitution in a lot of ways, from the way the Greeks look at it. You get a lot of energy from people feeling like they are contributing to the whole. You can recruit soldiers better if people feel like they have a stake in the political system. It unleashes a lot of talent, but, mob assemblies often make very bad decisions, very bad kind kind of emotionally driven decisions, self-interested decisions. And it requires, in Thucydides' mind, it requires a man, a rare man like Pericles, to not be led by the mob, to not just give them what they want, but to lead them in a way that's going to be the best. And so when a man like that has that kind of influence, of course, his enemies are going to attack him and say, you're a tyrant. You're trying to set yourself up as a monarch. But I think that it's fair to say that those accusations were entirely unfounded. But it goes to show how much he was able to kind of master people's emotions and their kind of vision of who they were as a people. And that was superpower, is just like giving the Athenians, making the Athenians the best version of themselves. And that required, hard power.
Well, you'd have to wonder too, as well as, you talk about the time period he's writing in. He also would have seen the Roman Revolution of the late Republic too. So he's seen some of these machinations in action, even more recent history for him as well.
Plutarch.
Plutarch, yeah,
exactly. Yeah, no, and Plutarch is very skeptical of democracy, as most imperial writers were, and really most writers that we have from antiquity were very skeptical of democracy. But I think Pericles is sort of the exception to the rule, that Athens really was an admirable, well-functioning state when he was in charge, and when he died, everything went down the toilet for Plutarch and also for Pericles, for Thucydides, as observers of the Athenian state.
Well, so I guess when we look at his building programs, so he had certain things he was working on related to the Parthenon, which I got engaged in front of 15 years ago.
Yeah, wow.
And the Odeon, which transformed Athens into more of a cultural powerhouse in that time period. How does Plutarch portray these as extensions of his statesmanship, and what would you say that his viewpoint on was using glory to unite a city?
Yeah, well, Plutarch, like a lot of Greeks, and the sources that he's using, point to this paradox, maybe you'd call it, that so much of the money to fund the Acropolis construction came from the fact that Athens at that time was the leader of an alliance that was designed to unite the various disparate Greek islands and city-states against the threat of Persian invasion. But over time, this is right after the Persian War. It's called the Delian League, and over time they sort of turn this alliance, in which they're notionally the first among equals, into de facto an empire. That when city-states or islands say, I don't think we really need to be in this alliance, Athens is like, all right, well, you don't have a choice. Now you're going to pay us taxes. You're our subject. And if you don't like that, well, we'll send the ships to show you who's boss. And this happens with Chios and Samos, bloody revolts that Athens puts down. Pericles puts down the revolt at Samos, one of the particularly bloody ones. Samos is a really powerful island. And but from that tribute, Athens, and they would deny these allegations. They would say that, that the money was really used for the defenses, but, it freed up capital, right? And that's the point. And that's kind of where the Acropolis comes from. But regarding your question about glory, this is certainly the story that Plutarch tells, that, he saw two things. There's a kind of a New Deal FDR aspect. There's all these kind of idlers and craftsmen who are sort of, working part-time, that constitutes some kind of unstable, potentially revolutionary element in a democracy. And Pericles puts them to work, all engaged in this massive public works project. But it's not just, building roads and bridges and digging canals. It's creating something really beautiful that will be a kind of beacon for Greeks of later ages, for Athenians of later ages. And there's the Parthenon friezes, the Elgin marbles, there's the Propylaea. There's so much amazing art from that period that that Plutarch says, characterizing it, they had a kind of, they have even today a certain freshness to them, but even when they were made, they also had this sort of patina of the antique upon them, so that they were both fresh and old as they were born. And that's true about the art of the Acropolis, that it's sort of archaizing a little bit. They're born classics. This is kind of like the definition of a classic. It's something fresh, but also has this timelessness to it. And you can see that in the speeches of Pericles and Thucydides as well, that you know it's about kind of uniting the Athenians on a project of, what better word for it is it than greatness? It's like Athenian greatness, reflecting the glory of Athens, that gives them this kind of patriotism and the sense of a higher purpose to their imperial machinations. That is something I think that is generous, that the Greeks can appreciate. That certainly there are democratic factions and oligarchic factions across the Greek world, and the democratic factions are all looking to Athens as kind of their champions and aspirationally, and the oligarchic factions are like resenting them for various reasons. But that was part of Athens's cultural power. Plato talks about this also, that Athens had this kind of like soft power, that people wanted to be like Athens. They wanted to be with Athens for the most part. You know, the occasional revolt aside, but the Acropolis was really a big piece of that.
Well, I think it's really important too to underscore too is understanding that I think when people look at ancient Greece, they don't quite understand city states and how they functioned.
Mhm.
And I think this also would have been a big part of him playing into Athenians being very, very proud of their culture and very proud of what they produce. So at the same time, I think it would have also been feeding into that too.
Absolutely, yeah, and they're really proud that they're Athenians and not Spartans and not Thebans. You know, I mean, the Spartans are admirable. They're a warlike people. They don't take interest in literature as a society. The Thebans are just kind of stupid pig farmers to the Athenians, and they have bad luck. I mean, all the Athenian tragedies, like Oedipus, Seven Against Thebes, so many of the Athenian tragedies are just about disasters at Thebes, which is their neighbor, and they just like to be superior. But I think that the the artwork and the kind of cultural vibrance of Athens, Pericles was able to make them feel like that was a product of their good political system, which is really important for that sense of unity and
Yeah.
commitment to the project,
Well,
especially in war.
I guess don't tell Philip II about Thebes because he held their military in very high esteem and it was a big influence on him.
It
But
was,
but I
yeah.
but I guess looking at it then, if we're looking at a lot of the challenges he faced, you mentioned the Delian League earlier, and Plutarch doesn't really shy away from giving us some of these scandals, like his relationship with Aspasia or the misuse of Delian League funds. What is, I guess, surprising about what we learn in this, and I guess, do you think it humanizes him in some way?
Absolutely. Plutarch tells about Aspasia. We should talk about her a little bit. So Aspasia is a courtesan, and she he brings her up in the context of this war with Samos, that some people accused him of uh, suppressing violently the revolt at Samos because of his personal relationship with her, because she hated the Samians. She was from Miletus, and Samos and Miletus are always, quarreling. But Aspasia is, okay, you could call her a kind of high ticket prostitute, but she's so much more than that.
Right.
She's kind of a philosopher courtesan, is how she's been passed on to antiquity.
Which, by
She
the way, during that time period would have been very standard, right? Because these women would have been schooled in a lot of these things because that would be part of their service.
Yeah, it's part of their service. You want a woman like that to be a charming attendant at your party, and you would not want your wife at a gentleman's party. Like that's disreputable. But a courtesan, it's totally fine. And I mean, not at all men's gatherings, but certainly she is an ornament, and it's a bit risque, but it's not like this is the kind of sex scandal that could bring down a politician. Of course, everybody has a legitimate wife for bearing legitimate children and your heirs, but then, the prominent men will have like a courtesan on the side or several. And so, but Pericles seems to have had a very special relationship with Aspasia. And she and Anaxagoras are, Anaxagoras kind of stays with him for all of his career until he dies. They're like chief intellectual, political influences around him. They're able to kind of gather smart people to Pericles' house to discuss the affairs of the Greeks. Maybe there's poetry and philosophy discussion. Maybe they're talking about, the earth floating around on water, but a lot of it is like, who are the people we need to bribe in Miletus? And Aspasia is just like a really key piece of the Pericles political machine. And so much so that it wasn't just business, right? Because he has this wife who's from a noble family, and he has two sons with her. But they both end up dying before he dies, and he ends up having one son left who's an illegitimate son that he's had with Aspasia. Now, he passed a law that no Athenian citizen can have anything but Athenian parents. That basically, in order to have citizenship, birthright citizenship, you have to have not just an Athenian dad, but also an Athenian mom. And which means it really kind of locks in citizenship. But after his second legitimate son died, he appealed to the people and got a special exception for him to be able to essentially adopt his illegitimate son as an Athenian citizen. Kid was named, I think the kid was named Xanthippus, or maybe it was Pericles. I think he was Pericles the Younger. And that Pericles the Younger ends up being a general at Arginusae. If you've studied Greek history, he's one of the generals that gets executed after the failure or after the scandal at Arginusae. Yeah, very tragic. So essentially, he's got, I think, and this ends up being a kind of a problem for him. To me, this is one of the lessons of Pericles' life that Thucydides doesn't talk about. This is, you really have to go to Plutarch for these kind of like personal details, which I think is one of the reasons why he's so interesting. But Pericles' relationship with his legitimate sons was not great. They quarreled a lot. His son was a spendthrift. He's just wasting all the money and asking his dad to pay off his debts. And when his dad refuses, they have a falling out. And I think this might have something to do with the fact that, when you have a half brother and your mother's still alive, and your dad has this other woman, it divides your loyalties, right? This is a really kind of toxic thing for founding a legacy. And it's one of the reasons I think monogamy is such a civilizational advantage, because it allows families to have this like power coherence through time. But apparently Pericles had a good relationship at least with his illegitimate son, who ended up being a very talented general and politician, although he had a sort of sad downfall.
It's interesting you point that out too, because for me, it's funny. I get obsessed with different periods of history, and earlier this year I was obsessed with the Renaissance and the Borgias and a lot of around that. But then recently I've been more into the Tudors and the Plantagenets as well. And you can kind of see how that, I guess, change in how family structure has a large part of how it influences us.
Yeah, and Tocqueville talks about this as one of the fundamental differences between the old European noble systems and the American system. That, in Europe, the general pattern is primogeniture. You have one son keeping the estate intact. The second or third son, maybe they become a priest or a soldier. But in America, the default is per stirpes, equally divided among your heirs, and this just breaks up over time. I mean, is it a big deal one generation to the next? Maybe not. Over 6 generations, that's a huge difference in the distribution of wealth. I mean, massive. And this is, it has its ups and downs. And Tocqueville says, I think, and Aristotle talks about these kind of things too in the Politics. I mean, this is how you can impoverish your nobility and basically delete your nobility from history after a couple of generations. So all these things I think are actually very interesting, the way that you arrange your estate legacy.
So I guess when we're looking at the life that Plutarch selects to arrange with him, it's this guy named Fabius Maximus, and
Hmm.
if you look at what Pericles favors, he favors naval power and really wants to avoid more land engagements. So I'm curious, when you look at why these two were paired, I'm curious what military tactics or their leadership style has to do with that.
Yeah, part of it is the fact that they are kind of very upstanding heroes for both traditions. But yeah, Fabius's signature move was he was the delayer, right? He didn't want to fight Hannibal. He's cut his supply lines, skirmish, but don't actually engage in battle. And that's a lot of what Pericles, his strategy in the Peloponnesian War was. So, for a little context, the Peloponnesian War is essentially Sparta growing increasingly impatient, and especially Sparta's allies like Corinth and Thebes growing increasingly impatient with Athenian hegemony in Greece. The Athenians are just throwing their weight around. They're kind of nouveau riche. The Spartans were the old superpower, and now the Athenians are kind of overtaking them. And so they finally kind of have some bone of contention, and they start the Peloponnesian War in 431 BC. And Pericles' policy is the Spartans are by far the best land power. They have not just the super elite, Green Beret, Navy SEAL, Spartiates, thousands of them, but they have this massive allied supplement. They have like a big, big army that they command of a coalition. We're not going to compete with them on land. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of do the thing that we did in the Persian War, is abandon our territory of Attica. And if you look at Attica on a map, it's quite large. I don't know if it's as big as New Jersey, but it's not like the Athenian territory. Athens is this little city with this huge swath of land. And, this made a lot of people uncomfortable. The idea of their family estates, their ancestral estates, their great farmlands, all the olive groves and so forth. They said, all right, we're just going to like hole in to the walls of Athens. We have a port connected. Piraeus is connected to Athens through these long walls, so we can keep ourselves supplied by the sea, and we're just going to kind of cede the land to the Spartans and not fight them directly. And it was a good strategy. Actually, it got tested, put to the test. The Athenians really tried to go back on it, especially after the plague. Pericles really had to use his powers of oratory to keep them sticking to the plan. It seemed unmanly to not defend your farmlands, much like it seemed unmanly to the Romans to not engage in battle with Hannibal. But Pericles said, no, our advantage is in the sea. As long as we can control the sea, we can keep ourselves supplied. We can harass them wherever we choose. We can choose the terms of battle. We have by far the best navy. And if they're stuck on land, they can't pry our allies off from us. And, Thucydides thinks that this strategy would have worked if they had stuck with it. Thucydides, writes with the benefit of hindsight. He lived
Sure.
to see the end of the war, but the problem was that Pericles died not too old. 3 or 4 years into the war, he succumbed to the plague himself. And after that, the demagogues took over. They decided to do this crazy expedition to Sicily, and which might not have gone so bad had they not undermined the generals, Alcibiades, that had undertaken it. And the Spartans eventually got this. The way that the war was won, in fact, was through naval power. The Spartans had to build a fleet. They got the Persians to pay for it. So Pericles was basically right all along, but when he wasn't there to help them execute on it, the war that he was the biggest proponent of, he's like, this war is inevitable. We can't let the Spartans push us around. We might as well fight it now, before they get any stronger. So that's one of the tragedies, I think, that he was right, but couldn't like make good on it because he just got taken away by fortune.
But I guess when we look at the Cost of Glory episodes you did about Pericles, you emphasize a lot
Well,
energy.
I didn't do Pericles yet, but he has appeared in some episodes.
Okay.
So stay tuned when I do the proper biography of Pericles. But I did some related characters. But
So I guess
yeah.
in looking at that, then I guess what is the trickiest part to really embody them? When we're trying to bring this to more of a modern listener.
Yeah, I think that a lot of us don't relate too much to party politics because we're not involved in them. Though, maybe we are vicariously. Um, a lot of us might have difficulty relating to the warrior spirit of the Greeks. These city states, as you said, people don't get. The Greeks were just constantly warring with each other. They are all in some form or another military aristocracies. Even Athens, as a democracy, they've got 100,000 people, but the citizenry is 15,000, 20,000 maybe men, and they're all expected to be fighters if they're of able body. And so I think getting around that can be hard for kind of peace-loving Christians like you and I. And but I do think that there is a lot to relate to in the way that Pericles cultivated the art of persuasion, cultivated the art of deal making. You can see this in some of his actions. He's very good at one of the things that he was most proud of, according to Plutarch, is that he never put to death any citizen, even though this was kind of par for the course, that any Athenian politician would be expected one way or another to, either execute his enemies on some trumped up charges or pay somebody off to murder them in the street. It's just like, it's a bloody game. And Pericles said that's the thing he was most proud of in his life, that he, even though he held the highest power, he never had to resort to that, or he refused to resort to that. So I think that, when we think of our own political situation, whatever side you're on, the people who are interested in emulation of the great men tend to be on one side of the spectrum. But to take care, to take real responsibility for the whole, not just your party, but the good of the state as a whole,
Yeah.
is just something that Pericles really exemplifies. And so I think that is a guide that we can use, for sure.
So I guess looking at it then for readers that are watching this and are listening to this, maybe they're new to the world of Plutarch, and this is something that's really driven an interest for them. I guess two questions here. And at first, how would you suggest a study of Plutarch? Like, how would you suggest someone approach that? And then, if we're looking at the life of Pericles in particular, are there certain things they should approach first, or should they just read it through, or what would be the best way to kind of approach this?
Well, the advice that Emerson gives in a text that a lot of people don't read, but you can find it online, is he wrote this essay on Plutarch, who was one of his favorite authors. He really modeled his career after Plutarch. He's an essayist, and he also wrote these kind of concise biographies of
my middle daughter's name, by the way, because we come from that same family line, the Emersons. But anyway.
Oh wow, fantastic! I'm very fond of Emerson. He's a great writer, and but he says that Plutarch is kind of like a gateway to the ancients for most average people, because the stories are they're concise, they're very relatable, they're just easy to read. He's a great, like, flowing writer. There's a lot of reflection on good and evil, virtue and vice, how political systems work. But you get these kind of great anecdotes, quotes that you can pull and put in your commonplace book. And that's the best way to integrate yourself into a period of history, is to just familiarize yourself with the main characters. And Plutarch gives you the main characters of all antiquity. He gives you them from the period of the Persian Wars, Themistocles, Aristides, etc., the Peloponnesian War, Pericles, Alcibiades. I did Lysander on the Cost of Glory podcast. If you're interested in the Greek history, that's the earliest Greek figure that I've covered. He's the guy that defeated the Athenians, Lysander of Sparta. Fascinating character. So pick a period that you're interested in, and I did an article on this on my Substack, how to read all of Plutarch's lives, and you can just see where they all fall in the historical spectrum. And you might be more interested in Rome. I mean, probably Rome is more familiar to people. You could start with Fabius Maximus and the Hannibalic Wars, or you could start with Julius Caesar, that people are more familiar with. And I've done a lot more series on the Romans thus far. So I did a whole arc on Julius Caesar. That's kind of what I'm imagining.
Which
the cost
I would recommend to people,
Mhm.
by the way, as well. And I just finished. Well, I didn't finish because I know the last segment's coming out yet. But your Civil War episode of Caesar's commentaries is really good as well.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a slog. I mean, a delightful slog. But I've been working on Caesar for really more than a year now, actually, because there's the biography itself, but then I wanted to do his commentaries as a side project. Caesar is just endlessly interesting, I think, especially for our times. I mean, so many interesting parallels to what we see today.
Well, I think the thing that's really interesting about this, and I had told you about this before we started recording, but one of my favorite, he's not really a historian, but he writes history, is Adrian Goldsworthy.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I like about his work, and we discussed this in our conversation, is he paints the picture of who people are. And I think that's what's really interesting about what you get from Plutarch, because in most history, we're told this person did this event happened. It's a lot of cause and effect. When you kind of realize, learning a lot about people, they also make certain decisions because of their own issues they're going through, their own self-interest. There's a lot more that goes into it that I think we get out of Plutarch.
Absolutely. And I've argued in various contexts that we should think more in terms of great men than in terms of great books, that the great books are kind of a gateway to learning about great men, great people, and their achievements, whether it's the author or the person depicted in the biographies, that something about familiarizing yourself with the story and the character of a person is like more actionable. And Plutarch is kind of the greatest example of like what you could call great man history, but it's really just biography. And
Sure.
If you start with Plutarch, then you can, if you want to go deeper, you can go into Thucydides, or you go to Herodotus, or you could go into Polybius, these guys that Plutarch used as a source, but give you a fuller picture. But it's a longer work, it's denser. Plutarch's lives, each of them you could read in an afternoon or two. They're typically 50 to 80 pages max, some of them even shorter.
Well, Alex, I've really appreciated you being our first guest for this, and I know it was a challenge for me because it's a different type of prep than I'm used to, where usually I'm talking to a person about a subject, where we're really talking about a book here. So I appreciate you, being willing to kind of work through this with me and be our first guest here. For people watching or listening, how can they connect with you? How can they find out more about you?
Yeah, appreciate it, Jeremy. Costofglory.com is my website, and you can find me on X at Cost of Glory or Alex Petkas. So those are the
Great.
easiest ways.
Very cool. And for people listening and watching, a reminder, this is something new we're doing, and we do want to make this something for you. If there's particular people you want to hear and we have access to them, we will do our best to get them. If there's particular books you would like to hear, we want to hear from you. If there's questions you have from some of these conversations, we want to hear from you as well. So be sure to reach out. Reminder, as I said, the actual site for the book club is atheniumbooks.com. So make sure you check that out as well. And we're going to do our best job to continue to deliver you a great product here. So thanks for hanging out today, everybody. Reminder to check out the next episodes as we're working on this. And Alex, once again, thank you so much for making some time for us today.
Always a pleasure.